Licentious and mystical obsessions merged together to haunt his brain, which was affected with a stubborn longing to escape the vulgarities of life and, ignoring the dictates of consecrated custom, to plunge into new and original ecstasies, into paroxysms celestial or accursed, but equally exhausting in the waste of phosphorus they involved. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I get to talk about Against Nature by Joris-Karl Huysmans. The original French title is A Rebours, which is more like Against the Grain. But Against Nature works just as well because a lot of it has to do with the character des Esseintes, who has escaped to the French countryside because he's sick of all the commonry, the plebeians, the mediocrity around him. His tastes are so elevated and so cultivated that he needs to create basically a hermitage in the countryside and surround himself with the aesthetic pleasures that bring him joy. I don't know if joy is the word, but they at least make him feel like he has better taste than everybody else. But this book is just so full of excess and decadence and abundance and exuberance, and I just loved it. I have taken to referring to this as not a novel, but an interior drama. Huysmans perfectly fuses the trenchant eye of a critic with the superb literary flourishes of a great novelist to deliver one of the touchstones of decadent literature. Like Schopenhauer, whom Huysmans praised, this book is partly an education in the aesthetics of pessimism. Schopenhauer, in his opinion, came nearer to the truth. His theory of pessimism was the great comforter of superior minds and lofty souls. Like I pointed out last week, it's really an interesting study in contrast that I just happened to have read The Wall by Marlon Haushofer right before reading Against Nature. They could make a really great essay, and there probably are some out there. I just didn't go and search for them. But the Haushofer novel is almost like showing what can happen to a human who doesn't have enough privilege, whereas the Huysmans is showing what could happen to the person who has too much. So with this combination of the pleasure of aesthetics and pessimism and decadence, des Esseintes turns his eye to the following discourses: literature, music, art, architecture, language, history, theology, philosophy, and music. So basically, this book presents a re-education in all of the humanities. But des Esseintes goes further and delivers these crackling oratories on alcohol, perfumes, and flowers. Those passages alone made this whole book worth reading. This is, of course, famous fin-de-siecle decadent literature and is that combination of ennui, which finds its most outward expression in the act of des Esseintes constantly slumping down in chairs and throwing himself down into the couch. And in fact, it could make a really great drinking game. Every time he slumps or throws or lets himself fall down and collapse into a chair, take a shot. You probably won't make it very far into the book. And there's that sort of perverse preference for artifice over nature. As a matter of fact, artifice was considered by des Esseintes to be the distinctive mark of human genius. At root, the driving factor for des Esseintes, though, is a sort of, it's born out of a terror of the mediocre, a terror of being just a common person, one among the masses, quotidian, pedestrian, not an epicure. It's a repulsiveness in the face of possible mediocrity. He is like many of us today, I believe, especially with our hyper connectivity. We're exposed to barrages of more and more people. It's like the combination of overpopulation plus hyperconnectivity has made it such that we are finding that it's harder and harder to get a sense of feeling unique, to get a sense of feeling set apart from the crowd. And so, on the one hand, it makes us depressed. On the other hand, or diametrically opposed to the FOMO and depression and so on, and social anxieties, on the other hand, it makes some of us even more desperate to try and gain a sense of uniqueness. And so Des Esseintes is one of those who is going to constantly escape from popular opinion. And I think more than just a contrarian or polemicist, he's reacting to the repulsion of being ordinary. For example, he says Goya's savage verve, his harsh, brutal genius, captivated Des Esseintes. On the other hand, the universal admiration his works had won rather put him off. So because it became popular, it's not for me anymore. Surely I don't even have an adjective for this. It's not really shocking. I mean, it may have been at the time that this was published in 1888, 1884, but maybe, I mean, it could become, it's partly comical, absurd, I guess, but probably the most absurd image and expression, moment of Des Esseintes' character and what he's striving for in this escape to the countryside where he's ensconcing himself in his literary and architectural and so on tastes, comes in this moment. A faint smile hovered over his lips when his servant eventually brought him a nourishing peptone enema and informed him that he was to repeat this injection 3 times every 24 hours. His taste for the artificial had now, without even the slightest effort on his part, attained its supreme fulfillment. No one, he thought, would ever go any further. Taking nourishment in this way, meaning in the form of an enema, was undoubtedly the ultimate deviation from the norm. So again, Des Esseintes has a very peculiar notion on how he is going to rise above the masses. When we think of decadence, I think that in general, we think about aesthetics and artifice over nature and function. But Des Esseintes desires a brand of decadence that is rooted in decay, in rot, in something old and perhaps natural, but tainted by human hands. Again, that sort of not extinction of nature, but the triumph of human hands over nature. Des Esseintes lost nothing of his interest in the Latin language now that it was rotten through and through and hung like a decaying carcass, losing its limbs, oozing pus, barely keeping, in the general corruption of its body, a few sound parts, which the Christians removed in order to preserve them in the pickling brine of their new idiom. These plants are really astounding, he said to himself, stepping back to appraise the entire collection. Yes, his object had been achieved. Not one of them looked real. It was as if cloth, paper, porcelain, and metal had been lent by man to nature to enable her to create these monstrosities. Where she had not found it possible to imitate the work of human hands, she had been reduced to copying the membranes of animals' organs, to borrowing the vivid tints of their rotting flesh, the hideous splendors of their gangrened skin. So again, we think about Oscar Wilde's dictum of nature imitating art, not the other way around. Des Esseintes has a mind, he's talking about Baudelaire here, but Des Esseintes, who is infatuated with Baudelaire, has a state of mind at once devout and impious. Nostalgic memories of Catholicism stimulated by fits of neurosis. The fact is that when the period in which a man of talent is condemned to live is dull and stupid, the artist is haunted, perhaps unknown to himself, by a nostalgic yearning for another age. And so what's so interesting is that, as Patrick McGinnis says in his introduction to this Penguin Classics edition, it was held up, meaning Against Nature, was held up by some as a cautionary tale and by others as a manual of modern living. It was read as a moral fable and as a chilling case study of crisis and debauchery. I think what first attracted me to this book, I snagged it up many years ago and have just now come to read it. But what initially attracted me is just that plot point of a guy who's disillusioned with the uncultured quotidian society around him, decides to build this hermitage in the countryside and fill it with all of the art and architecture and books that he loves. And that really resonated with me because if you're like me, I have this recurring daydream, this recurring fantasy where I'm going to somehow get to go and be isolated in a cabin for 1 year. And I can take whatever books I want with me. And I kid you not, I constantly curate these lists of books that I would take with me for that year. And it's just a little daydream, just a fun little daydream that I have. And when I read something like this whole book is about someone who's basically doing that, then this is my chance to do exactly what keeps me a well-nourished, healthy bookworm, and that is live vicariously through someone else's eyes. So if you find yourself sort of put off by everyone and everything around you, you can't really make sense of the world you're in, people's taste don't align with yours, this book is your chance to join Des Esseintes in his countryside chateau. He could detect such inveterate stupidity, such hatred of his own ideas, such contempt for literature and art and everything he held dear, implanted and rooted in these mean, mercenary minds, exclusively preoccupied with thoughts of swindling and money grubbing, and accessible only to that ignoble distraction of mediocre intellects, politics, that he would go home in a fury and shut himself up with his books. Did he know a single individual who was capable of appreciating the delicacy of a phrase, the subtlety of a painting, the quintessence of an idea, or whose soul was sensitive enough to understand Mallarmé and love Verlaine? In this way, Against Nature is a decadent variation on the theme of Thoreau's Walden. In Walden, of course, Thoreau wanted to spend a year withdrawn from society so that he could sort of get back to the basics and get out from underneath all the societal and economic pressures that were enslaving him to more and more material means or material things. Really, he wanted to rid himself, to shed himself of the need for material things as much as possible. Des Esseintes, on the other hand, wants to escape society in order to further increase his dependency on material. In the end, what makes this one of the reasons that I think this is such an enduring book is that it isn't just a sort of journal of the different things he read and the different things he listened to and the different alcohols he drank, the different flowers he had brought in, and his thoughts on everything in the humanities. It actually has a trajectory. And towards the end, we start to see that his very escape from normalcy in order to achieve this sort of sublime existence is the very thing that starts to kill him. And now he's sort of forced to grapple with the notion that a return to the very cage that he was trying to escape is now his only real recourse to survival. But still, that whole sort of journal or diary of all of his preferences, and especially the things that aren't his preferences, it's just such a joy to read. And it's written in a prose that's worthy of such a refined and cultured and decadent mind. In fact, for American readers, I would even suggest getting the British English translation from Robert Baldick because it sort of uses that more elevated British English. Des Esseintes is not shy about his tastes, and the people he considers buffoons are just wonderful because he considers Virgil and Ovid and Rabelais and Molière, Balzac and Voltaire and Diderot all buffoons. He praises Petronius and Poe, Mallarmé, Odilon Redon, Baudelaire, and Gustave Moreau. Baudelaire had gone further. He had descended to the bottom of the inexhaustible mine, had picked his way along abandoned or unexplored galleries, and had finally reached those districts of the soul where the monstrous vegetations of the sick mind flourish. There, near the breeding ground of intellectual aberrations and diseases of the mind, the mystical tetanus, the burning fever of lust, the typhoids and yellow fevers of crime, he had found, hatching in the dismal forcing house of ennui, the frightening climacteric of thoughts and emotions. Another absurd moment that happens early on is that Des Esseintes so needs everything thoroughly encrusted with ornamentation that bejeweling the shell of his pet tortoise literally kills the tortoise. So that's the most extreme representation of artifice over nature, or man, or artifice conquering nature. His ennui leads him, of course, to just embrace a life of leisure and pleasure, and he just swathes himself in material analgesics. Buried deep in a vast wing chair, his feet resting on the pear-shaped, silver-gilt supports of the andirons, his slippers toasting in front of the crackling logs that shot out bright tongues of flame as if they felt the furious blast of a bellows, Des Esseintes put the old quarto he had been reading down on a table, stretched himself, lit a cigarette, and gave himself up to a delicious reverie. That drive towards extreme opulence and ornamentations are what catalyze so many of his barrages of incredible and intricate descriptive prose. One section of the bookshelves lining the walls of Des Esseintes' blue and orange study was filled with nothing but Latin works which minds drilled into conformity by repetitious university lectures lumped together under the generic name of the decadence. That restrictive idiom, Latin, with its limited stock of almost invariable constructions, without suppleness of syntax, without color, without even light and shade, pressed flat along all its seams and stripped of the crude but often picturesque expressions of earlier epochs. That idiom could, at a pinch, enunciate the pompous platitudes and vague commonplaces endlessly repeated by the rhetoricians and poets of the time. But it was so tedious and unoriginal that in the study of linguistics, you had to come down to the French style currently in the age of Louis XIV to find another idiom so willfully debilitated, so solemnly tiresome and dull. A cup of tea, an impeccable blend of si à foillon, mouilloutin, and Kansky, yellow teas brought from China into Russia by special caravans. He drank this liquid perfume from cups of that oriental porcelain known as eggshell china. It is so delicate and diaphanous. And just as he would never use any but these adorably dainty cups, so he insisted on plates and dishes of genuine silver gilt, slightly worn so that the silver showed a little where the thin film of gold had been rubbed off, giving it a charming old world look, a fatigued appearance, a moribund air. Indeed, each and every liqueur, in his opinion, corresponded in taste with the sound of a particular instrument. Dry curacao, for instance, was like the clarinet with its piercing velvety note. Kümmel, like the oboe with its sonorous nasal timbre. Creme de menthe and anisette, like the flute, at once sweet and tart, soft and shrill. Then, to complete the orchestra, there was Kirsch, blowing a wild trumpet blast, gin and whiskey raising the roof of the mouth with the blare of their cornets and trombones, marsh brandy matching the tubas with its deafening din, while pearls of thunder came from the cymbal and the bass drum, which Iraq and Mastique were banging and beating with all their might. I mean, this prose is just wonderful. When he's talking about making perfumes, mixing different things to make perfumes, he says, to do this, he had first had to master the grammar, to understand the syntax of smells, to get a firm grasp on the rules that governed them, and once he was familiar with this dialect, to compare the works of the great masters, to analyze the construction of their sentences, to weigh the proportion of their words, to measure the arrangement of their periods. Is sort of an interesting, almost synesthesia of putting a grammar around perfume. But it's the same that he does with that analogy of musical instruments and alcohols. Overall, one of the things I'm most thankful for is that Huysmans led me to the artwork of Gustave Moreau. I think that I've come into touch with it. My eyes have brushed over Moreau pieces before because something was vaguely familiar about it. But especially the oil paintings, his most famous ones, Jupiter and then Tattooed Salome and Salome Dancing, are explicitly in this book. And I went and looked them up, and now I'm sort of obsessed with Gustave Moreau. But Moreau now is like the emblematic figure of Against Nature, of Des Esseintes. And indeed, it turns out that Huysmans wrote some critical pieces praising Gustave Moreau. He had set his heart on finding a few pictures of subtle, exquisite refinement, steeped in an atmosphere of ancient fantasy, wrapped in an aura of antique corruption, divorced from modern times and modern society. For the delectation of his mind and the delight of his eyes, he had decided to seek out evocative works which would transport him to some unfamiliar world, point the way to new possibilities, and shake up his nervous system by means of erudite fancies, complicated nightmares, suave and sinister visions. Among all the artists he considered, there was one who sent him into raptures of delight, and that was Gustave Moreau. The truth being that Gustave Moreau was nobody's pupil. With no real ancestors and no possible descendants, he remained a unique figure in contemporary art. So there again, it's that uniqueness, how to stand out from the crowd. If you look at the Jupiter painting and the Salome paintings, you'll get a sense of that sort of aesthetic register of Des Esseintes, and by extension, Acheborg. Just as he points out that Edgar Allan Poe's stories, whose terrifying or hallucinating effects Odilon Redon seem to have transposed into a different art, and you can see these, especially his lithographs. In the same way, it's like Huysmans wanted to transpose the visual art of Moreau into this prose. In terms of a conventional novel, nothing really happens. But in terms of an interior drama, a great deal takes place in Against Nature. The plot is nothing short of grappling with a way of existing and dealing with the world. And like all enduring works of art, Huysmans leaves us with a paradox of an ambiguous revelation. He realized at last that the arguments of pessimism were powerless to comfort him, that only the impossible belief in a future life could bring him peace of mind. And in the end, and above all, who wouldn't want to read the book that Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray called poisonous and the strangest book he had ever read?